Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. And thank you for attending our webcast, Adopting Power BI for Your Organization. My name is Quon. I'm a Principal Business Intelligence and Analytics Consultant at Thorogood. I'm joined here by my colleague, Alaistair, who is also a Business Intelligence and Analytics Consultant. We generally work together in our Thorogood Boston office, but for obvious reasons, we're all remote at this given time. But Alaistair and I are both members of our U.S. management team, and we've been working with Power BI specifically for many, many years at this point. So today, what are we talking about? Well, we'll start with a quick introduction to Thorogood. We'll then go into some challenges that we've seen some of our customers have when they are adopting Power BI in their organization, and then actually spend the majority of the time talking about a pretty high-level framework for how you might look to adopt Power BI in your firm. So Thorogood, who are we? What do we do? We help our customers make sense of their data. We help our customers efficiently and effectively transform and leverage their data to have data-driven decision-making. We've been founded over 30 years ago out of the UK, when we have global offices in Philadelphia, Boston, as I've mentioned before, Singapore, Sao Paulo, and Bangalore, India. The way in which we help our customers is really sitting with them and understanding what their business goals are for any particular initiative or use case, bringing to the table what we know the breadth and depth of potential technical possibilities can be, and then coming together to come up with a number of opportunities that we can move forward with to help those organizations. With respect to the specific services we provide, they're pretty wide-ranging and really anything that has to do with data and analytics, I would say. So from strategies and roadmaps, how do you organize your particular business units and your IT units to leverage data and analytics most efficiently and effectively? How do you design and implement an end data and analytics solution, and all the way through to support, training, and user empowerment. One of the things I will look to call out is that Thorogood is an independent consulting. So we do partner with kind of a wide array of the technology vendors that we see most prevalent in the industry and the industries that we work with at any given moment in time. So you can imagine in the technology landscape, these vendors and the tools that they're using are constantly changing. So it's pretty important from our perspective that we are partnering closely with these technology vendors so that we can keep a pulse on what the latest and greatest tools are for our customers. And of particular interest in today's webcast will be our Microsoft partnership. We've been a Microsoft partner for over 10 years across a number of different competencies. And as we think about Power BI, we've been using Power BI in conjunction with Microsoft for over 5 years at this point. So let's talk about the ways in which you can adopt Power BI in your organization. We've seen it in generally two different ways. The first is what you might think of as kind of bottom up. So this is where you have individual power users that might exist in different parts of your organization that's still savvy, and they might be the same power users that were creating those Excel reports that had advanced pivot tables or macros. And those users have decided, well, Power BI is a desktop tool, it's free, I'm going to download it and start doing some of those reports themselves. So you'll find that these pockets of power users start adopting Power BI. Those reports get utilized more and more and shared to more and more users. And at some point, your IT organization gets wind of it and decides, well, this is an up-and-coming tool. It's popular and it's being used by the business. Let's truly evaluate it and determine what the strategy would be for ensuring that it is an enterprise-ready tool. On the flip side is where you have an IT organization that maybe has a particular relationship with Microsoft. They've heard about Power BI. They know it's the latest and greatest. They've done their own assessment and evaluation, and they've put it into their modern data architecture roadmap. And there's an intent to then take the Power BI tool and socialize it with the various business users. across the two different paths, they can be occurring at the same time, especially when you think about some of these larger organizations that have differing business segments that kind of operate independently. And that's totally fine as well. But no matter which path you're on, or even if it's both paths, the ultimate objective is to successfully roll out Power BI to drive adoption, to drive better and faster data-driven decisions. The thing about rolling out Power BI is that we've seen across a number of our customers that there are some patterns of challenges. And it's pretty important that we take stock of what those challenges are, because it'll make the design and ultimate rollout of Power BI in your firm that much more robust and more seamless. So we'll talk about 6 different challenges here. The first one is alignment with business needs. Now, whether it's Power BI or any tool, honestly, it's incredibly important to know exactly how and why your business users will be using those tools, because the way in which they will interact with them should be incredibly important for how you ultimately design a platform that will enable that interaction. Thinking of users that might be looking for like monthly standardized reporting versus users that want a self-service sandbox where they can go and play. And to what degree do you have different, like the spectrum of those users, what percentage of your users are on either ends of the spectrum, et cetera. Once again, pretty important for your ultimate design. Balance between control and openness, also very important and arguably pretty tricky. If you think about the Power BI desktop tool, it is a free piece of software that you can download and install on your machine so long as you have the admin rights to do so. And what that's enabled a lot of the business users that we've spoken to is very quick and ad hoc analytics. You can just go ahead and connect to a local sample data sets, come up with different ways to view the data, and maybe you come up with some insights that you showcase to your larger business unit and a larger team. And the wait time is minimal. It's just the amount of time it takes for that individual user to be comfortable with creating that report. So it's fantastic from an ad hoc analytics perspective. If you think of the other side of it, from an IT point of view, if you have these pockets of different business users that are all creating these reports, there's a governance view that's pretty important, because let's say the last thing you want is for multiple KPIs to be in these monthly reports that aren't actually showing the same numbers. So there is an aspect of control that is important, and getting that balance between people feeling empowered to create their own reports as quickly as possible and the governance of the data and the reports themselves is pretty important to think about. Training. I've already talked a little bit about this, kind of the spectrum of different users you can imagine would be using your Power BI tenant. But once you do have the tenant, you want to ensure like better adoption and ongoing adoption of the different tools. It's important to think of, for those users, what types of training programs would you want to provide to them to enable them within their own analytics journey. So your power user might not be particularly interested in a very basic Power BI dashboard in a day. And on the flip side, your senior VP of finance might not be interested in your advanced modeling part 2 training program. So thinking of the different types of users and ensuring that you put together a program that is tailored to those different types of users is pretty paramount. Also talked about this a little bit in terms of the data sets and reports that you have. There's a governance aspect to it, ensuring that you have one version of the truth, as well as governing the ways in which reports are disseminated and the data modeling behind those, and ensuring that they are built as efficiently as possible so as not to take up too much of your performance on your tenant itself. The other interesting thing about Power BI is that, at least with the online service, but arguably also with the desktop tool itself, you can imagine Microsoft is continuously rolling out updates. 5 years ago, those updates were happening every 2 weeks. It then went to every month, and I think more recently it's become updates every quarter as the tools become much more enterprise ready, very, very robust. But with the platform updates, how exactly do you then push those updates to your organization? At what points do you do those IT security checks? Do you provide those updates at the same frequency that Microsoft does? So what are those considerations? And then the final one I'll discuss here is a multi-tool strategy. So you likely were using tools before Power BI existed in your organization. Do those tools still exist? You might have a variety of different semantic layer tools also within your organization. How do they play with Power BI? And moving forward, when you have different business groups, who have marketing team A and marketing team B, that are looking to analyze their data, how and when and why should they use Power BI versus another tool in your organization? So having that strategy and clarity and quick answer to those questions is also something to think about. All right, so we'll go into an adoption framework. And I mentioned this earlier. It is fairly high level, and really to provide you a sense of the ways in which you would organize and put together your adoption framework and tailor it to your particular organization. Fairly simple. The first part is the assessment, so just understanding where you are right now and where you're looking to go. The second around design, so how would you actually architect your platform, laying that foundation down. Enablement, so once you have it set, how do you build out your community? How do you develop those applications? And then finally, governance. How do you make it robust and ensure responsible usage? So we'll start with assessments. How do you do the assessment? Well, it's important that you take stock of how both the business and IT have been feeling around the challenges that they face with respect to these data and analytics applications. What are those pain points? Anything you'd like to see changed moving forward? And you can have those conversations through in one-on-one interviews with stakeholders, through like full stakeholder workshops, through surveys, really any forum or any media that drives conversation and engagement. The second thing to think of is culture. Culture is incredibly important. The data culture specific. How is data being shared? How is it being consumed by different users? You have IT sending out applications, or do you have those pockets of power users that are building reports? And determining exactly to what level you would like each of those to happen is important when you ultimately design your platform. The other thing I'll talk about is this concept of a citizen data engineer or data scientist. That's become pretty prevalent in a lot of the customers that we speak to. So individuals that are pretty technical and understand the technical aspects of transforming data. So you might want to have kind of a separate session with those users as well. I already talked about the spectrum of users, going from the individuals who might just consume all the way to those data scientists. So just know exactly what your user group looks like. And then finally here, the types of data sets that you would expect your users to connect to. Power BI can connect to almost all of them. It can connect to a wide variety of different data sets, but it's important to know which ones are on premises, which ones are cloud hosted, which ones are software as a service, and what are the design considerations for connecting to any of them. Speaking of design, I will hand it over to Alaistair to talk about that, please.
Thanks, Amanda. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see my video now. So I will pick up with the topic of design. So you've undertaken your assessment, you understand where you currently stand, and you've identified a target state. So it's time to kind of action that. So a couple of components of design to consider. I'll start with the architectural components. So there are a whole suite of tools that are part of the Power BI offering, and we've spoken about some of them already. You've got Power BI Desktop, which is the desktop software used to author and edit reports. You've got Power BI Service for sharing reports. You've got Power BI Mobile for consuming shared reports on mobile devices and tablets. Then you've got a relatively new offering, but it is an evolution of SQL Server Reporting Services, another Microsoft tool in Report Builder that allows you to build more more pixel perfect static reports as opposed to dynamic Power BI dashboards. Each serve their own purpose, and there are degrees of potential overlap, of course, but it's important to consider which tool you're using, which tools you're training on, to what extent, and how are these being managed. Another consideration for almost any IT tool is licensing. So there are different licensing options for Power BI. There's the Power BI Pro licensing model, which is really on a per user basis, and it's perhaps good for smaller organization or an enterprise organization as they're getting started on their journey. And then you've got Power BI Premium, which is more of a capacity-based licensing model, gives you more kind of degrees of freedom in terms of getting more users onboarded. And you do have access to some premium features that are specific to that license. We've spoken about data sources in the context of your assessment, but Power BI can support a number of data sources, and it's important to consider how these are kind of being managed. So you're able to connect to cloud sources, on-premise sources, software as a service sources. These could be platform as a service, Azure sources, for example, or on-premises legacy Oracle databases, for example. Microsoft is now a very open company, and Power BI is able to connect to tools well beyond those offered by Microsoft. It's important to establish Power BI gateways for those common enterprise tools. So the gateway enables connectivity between those data sources and Power BI. And setting that up at an IT level will enable all users to kind of have the access that they need to those sources. And then another important and neat feature of Power BI really is the ability to kind of endorse data sets. So if there are data sets that are understood and trusted, those can be endorsed, and thereby a lot of users can tap into them and not necessarily reinvent the wheel every time they need to create Power BI reports. So another area of design to consider is the workspace design. So workspaces are shared areas for hosting data and reports and collaborating within that Power BI service. So how do you segment workspaces? How do you structure workspaces and apps within the workspaces? Do you have prod, non-prod? Do you break things down by geography and function, or some permutation of these things? It's a pretty essential thing to consider and think about within those workspaces. What is the security setup like, and how are things shared? So I just mentioned security, but of course security is a critical consideration when we're talking about an organization's data and potentially sensitive data. So a general conversation about security in the design portion of your rollout is important. Things to consider: how users authenticate Power BI, how do you access Power BI from anywhere, what are your privacy regulations, and how does that differ based on the data being accessed and the users? What kind of activities are permitted? In some cases, an organization might have external vendors they work with, for example, and they might want to permit some degree of access, but that needs to be very well managed and controlled. So security is another important design consideration. And then finally, administration. Again, this kind of ties in with security, but operationally, how is Power BI managed? So who assigns those licenses? We talked about licensing. Who assigns access to Power BI? Who creates and manages the workspaces? A lot of organizations have that pretty well controlled, but someone needs to be able to ultimately control and create workspaces. Who responds to questions that arrive, etc. So with that design in mind and things being rolled out, it's time to think about enablement. So, an effective rollout strategy starts small, but effectively. So essentially identifying key relevant groups that could pilot ways of working, could pilot the use of Power BI. So a specific division or team that is a heavy user of BI reporting analytics tools would be useful. If those groups could then identify a couple of applications or projects that they could work on that use Power BI and they could be guided in that use, that would be helpful. And then as they go, information sharing sessions internally between those teams and IT, those teams and other teams using Power BI is important. So starting small, ensuring that the initial projects or the initial initiatives using Power BI are successful, well liked by the business, will guarantee that Power BI becomes a mainstay of the organization. The next point to consider is training. And Amanda alluded to Thorogood services that we offer, and the bulk of what we do is application design and development, but that informs our ability to train. So Microsoft has an ecosystem of partners that are well adept at using tools like Power BI, and they offer training. So you could look externally for training. Perhaps you look externally initially and then train the trainer. Sessions are conducted so that you have internal training resources. But thinking about conducting training is very important so that your users feel comfortable using the tool. And Amanda also spoke about the different types of users. So You might want foundational training for some users. You want advanced training for what we'd call power users or data scientists. But a spectrum of training is important, making sure that everyone has some degree of fluency with Power BI. And make sure that this training is kind of an ongoing process. It's not a one-off thing, but it's a continuous learning cycle. It will certainly be informed by prior trainings. So there might be things that are new or things that were learned from those prior trainings that would be important to incorporate. So making sure that trainings are available and that learnings are ongoing is very important. And finally, in terms of enablement and rollout, important to think about fostering a community or culture. And I think this could be understated, but shouldn't be. So fostering a culture of learning, sharing, and collaboration with respect to Power BI is important. So setting up things like user groups, collaboration forums, lunch and learns webinars, that you host or you join external webinars or you join Microsoft sessions, etc., is important. Business and IT champions are very nice to have, especially if they span both of those sides of the fence, so to speak. So you want champions within the business who understand Power BI but are close to the business problems. You want IT champions who understand the business but are more steeped in the technical side of things. But generally having a kind of a culture, a community of people that are enthusiastic about Power BI, that understand it, that can help others is important, because while we talk about formal training, with the kind of proliferation of the tool, I think there's a lot of informal training that can be achieved through having a strong community culture. And then kind of a point that underpins design and enablement is understanding like governance and having governance in mind when rolling out Power BI. So governance is important. A few points that I'll talk to here, the first one being best practices, but ensuring consistency and adherence to quality, that is key. If you've got business users that are consuming Power BI, they will much prefer and enjoy a tool that is used in a relatively unified way. So they know what they're looking at when they access a Power BI report. So things like the filter experience, the filters being in a common place and understanding how those filters work, that's important. You don't want users that are confused as to how to begin to work with the tool and derive some insights. Important to kind of develop those best practices. So where do the filters go? What does the look and feel like? How do we organize report pages for a consistent look and feel? Providing tips and tricks. So, if, for example, best practices when data modeling, and then DAX calculations, and what are some quick tricks that you can teach people with DAX. And also just thinking about what are some standard templates or start points that you can provide. So the users are kind of picking up from an established point and things are somewhat unified to begin with. So there isn't a huge degree of freedom and therefore not much overlap between reports that are developed. The next kind of 2 points are relatively hand in hand, but thinking about auditing and performance monitoring is important. So remaining abreast of how much and how often the tool is used, how well it's used. There's a good deal of kind of data that's available to you via the Power BI platform as to how much things are being used, how often, for example, a report is being accessed. You can see that's quite granular levels of detail. So it's important to keep track of that and understand how popular the tool is and what is popular. Also, you can manage the capacity utilization. So understanding how much capacity remains. Talk about licensing, but this is a kind of an aspect of that. And then DevOps. So DevOps is kind of a hot topic these days, particularly with cloud infrastructure and applications. How does DevOps work with Power BI? Well, there are some kind of exciting updates coming, particularly around continuous deployment. So keep an eye on that and understand what's available out of the box that integrates with your general IT practices around DevOps. That's kind of all of the aspects of an adoption framework that we had in mind. I would say that it is not a static framework. This is dynamic, and we're expecting, as with the training aspect, for example, for it to be a feedback loop. So you learn as you go along. Nothing is set in stone, and aspects of what you're doing, your rollout could inform your governance and best practices, or your design, in fact. So this is supposed to be relatively dynamic and fluid, but some key considerations to think about as you go. The other thing to consider is the broader Power Platform. Microsoft offers a suite of tools as part of the Power Platform beyond Power BI. So you've got Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agents. These integrate nicely with Power BI, and these enable things like write back, embedding Power BI in applications for kind of a more dynamic feel. So when you feel comfortable with your adoption of Power BI, perhaps it's time to move on to consider some of the other Power Platform tools that exist. And there's a lot to that can be used to enhance Power BI. With that said, I'd like to thank everyone for their time and joining us today. If you have any questions, as Amanda said, feel free to contact us directly and we'll get in touch. Thank you, everyone.